Next, from Springfield, Michael Carrigan of the AFL-CIO and Perry Browder, the current president of the Illinois Trial Lawyers Association, among others, hold a press conference to discuss workers' compensation reform. This runs about 25 minutes.
I'm Michael Carrigan. I'm president of the Illinois AFL-CIO. I've been a state fed officer for slightly over 16 years. As we've gone through the regular session here in 2016, off and on, up and down, there's been discussion about reforms to worker comp. As you know, there was an agreed bill process back in 2011. Labor, the trial lawyers were stakeholders, were part of that process, and it resulted in significant savings to the worker comp system. Now we have Governor Bruce Rauner, who took office 16 months and about a week ago, 10 days ago, and when he started his administration, he started with something called the turnaround agenda. You know, I don't know how anybody could take a casual look at the turnaround agenda document and not agree that it was about an attack on the middle class workers, and particularly those of us in organized labor. So recently here, there's been discussion about worker comp reform, and I want to be very clear that we're in no mood, we have no appetite for worker comp reform, and we will use our collective resources to vigorously oppose worker comp changes. Back in 2011, there were significant reforms. There were probably over 30 components of comp that was changed. It's our estimate that it saved the worker comp industry, employers, $1 billion to $1.5 billion. But our job is to protect workers who are hurt. It's a very difficult, stressful time in their life. It can be very devastating for them. They're trying to get benefits. They're trying to get their injuries attended to medically, but it often is the case that they're being starved out. They're not receiving worker comp benefits, and of course their mortgage is due. They've got groceries, and their bills go on and on and on. So we're not interested in being part of a reform that is all about reducing benefits and rights for workers. So with that, we'll bring up Perry.
Good morning. I'm glad we're here today to talk about workers' compensation. My name is Perry Browder. I'm with the current president of Illinois Trial Lawyers. I'm with the law firm of Simmons, Hanley, Conroy out of Alton. The important part of talking about workers' comp is that we've already done this. We've gone through this before. We did an agreed bill process, we made changes, and there's been significant savings. But what I think we need to realize when the governor is talking about attacking individuals that are injured, that have been hurt on the job, or people that have been killed on the job, that the state's budget problems are not going to be solved by making changes to workers' compensation. The state's pension problems are not going to be solved by making changes to workers' compensation. And both the budget and the pension shouldn't be solved on the backs of injured workers or people that have lost ones that have been killed in a work setting. So we have to keep that in mind, that this is not going to solve those problems. The changes have already been made, and there are savings that are out there. What we need to focus on is that these savings have not been passed on to the businesses. There should be some insurance review, or you could call it insurance reform, so that we need to look at what has been going on since these changes have been put in place, how much has been saved, and why this is not being passed on to the businesses. There are a lot of companies writing workers' comp policies in the state of Illinois. The state of Illinois has great programs for injured workers. The workers' comp system is working. The last thing somebody that goes to work on any given day, whether they're coming to work at the Capitol or going to work at a factory, is that they want to get injured and end up having to go get compensated and not be able to work again, or to have their job changed because they can't do the job that they used to do. So we have to keep that in mind. That's not something people want to be participating in. It's a situation of last resort. They've already given up their rights to sue in the tort system. They've agreed to the big bargain that you have a system in place that if you get hurt on the job that you will be compensated. So with that, we look forward to speaking with you today, and you'll hear from Mr. Menchetti. Oh, I'm sorry.
Good morning. My name is Jock Hardy. I'm the legislative representative for the Illinois Nurses Association. We are here today to oppose any changes to workmen's compensation. As you know, nurses provide a service to a lot of people in a lot of different ways. They also take an oath to provide serious services in life-threatening situations. Our nurses also experience a lot of devastating situations with taking care of people that have life-threatening issues, taking care of people that have light issues. But at the same time, nurses experience problems also as getting injured on the job. Nurses provide over and over rigorous training, everyday, constant, routine scenarios that cause elbows, back injuries, a lot of certain injuries that really, as they're trying to help people, they end up getting hurt. The current compensation scenario, in a lot of cases, and nobody's getting rich on this, a lot of nurses, as they get injured and a lot of career-ending injuries, they're forced with having to find some other way to supplement their income. As Mike said earlier, a lot of people can't pay their bills. You have to eat, you have to pay your mortgage. When you get hurt as a nurse, as a profession that you've chosen, you spend a lot of years studying this field, and to get hurt and not to be able to provide for your family anymore, that is a devastating scenario. In 2015, the National Public Radio, they quoted a Department of Labor stat that said 35,000 nurses annually hurt their back to the point that they cannot go to work another day. So with those kind of stats out there, it's kind of hard to understand why we want to cut some compensation for people that are providing services to people.
Would you mind saying your name again?
Jock Hardy. J-O-C-K. Yes, sir.
Illinois Nurses Association, got that right.
So really, we oppose anything that causes any type of changes to the work, to a safe work environment, to providing, and especially providing patient safety. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Dave Menchetti, and I'm with the Chicago law firm of Cullen, Haskins, Nicholson, and Menchetti. My firm and I have been the technical advisors to the state AFL-CIO on workers' compensation issues for 40 years. Not me personally for 40 years, but the firm has. So what I'm here to do today is to remind you a little bit about what has already happened in 2011, to remind you about the results that have been obtained after the 2011 reductions to workers' compensation rights, and tell you a little bit about what the House and Senate have already done in 2015 after those changes were made. So to refresh your memory, I know a lot of you were around here in 2011. There were changes made to the Workers' Compensation Act that severely reduced rights and compensation to injured workers. Those changes addressed everything from medical treatment costs to compensation paid to injured workers. There were more than 30 changes made to the law at that time, as President Carrigan has already mentioned. So I just want to run through a few of those to remind you the comprehensive nature of the reductions that were made in 2011. Reimbursement rates to doctors and hospitals where nurses work were reduced by 30% across the board. So if you were a medical provider in this system and you were providing treatment to an injured worker, from one day to the next, your reimbursement rate got cut by 30%. The changes limited what doctors could charge for prescriptions. So doctors now, when they provide prescriptions to patients, medication to patients, they're strictly limited as to what they can charge patients for those prescriptions. Access to medical treatment was limited in preferred provider programs that employers could set up. Benefits were reduced for temporary partial disability, which is a form of compensation that an injured worker gets when he can return to work, but not at the same level that he was working at before. Compensation was limited for what we call wage differential claims. So these kinds of cases where, as has already been talked about, a nurse might not be able to return to work in an operating room, and as a result of that, she has to take a cut in pay. Those types of benefits were severely limited by the changes in 2011. Compensation paid for carpal tunnel cases, severely limited by the changes in 2011. The changes in 2011, the reductions in 2011 adopted the use of something called the AMA Guides to Permanent Impairment, which limited the permanent partial disability benefits that injured workers could receive. And on and on and on, all right? Like I said, more than 30 changes, and I'll be happy to talk more about those in detail if anybody has any questions about that. But what I want everybody to try and remember is that these were comprehensive changes, affected just about every provision of this law. So it was not just a good beginning or a small tweak or a little change, as some people have said. And in fact, we now know that these significant reductions had a significant impact. And how do we know that? Because there are certain things that we can measure after the 2011 reductions went into place. And we now know beyond all doubt, that those 2011 reforms reduced workers' compensation costs. Just a few indications of how costs were reduced after the reductions in 2011. One primary indication is the reductions that have been recommended by an organization called the National Council on Compensation Insurance, NCCI. This is the rate-making organization for the state of Illinois. So this is the organization that sets the rates for workers' compensation insurance in Illinois. Since 2011, NCCI has recommended nearly a 20% reduction in workers' compensation rates. Another way to measure that reduction is to measure it in terms of the national median. The Illinois rate drop has been 24 points compared to the median. As far as I can tell, that's the largest drop in the country since that time, the largest drop in the country since 2011 caused by the workers' compensation reductions. What else do we know from NCCI findings? We know that there have been improved indemnity loss ratios driven by decreases in average indemnity severity. That's just a fancy way, I guess, of saying that insurance companies are paying less in losses now than they were prior to the 2011 changes. Another indication of how well these reductions have worked, at least for insurance companies in the state of Illinois, is that Illinois continues to be the #1 market for workers' compensation insurance companies in the United States of America. There are over 325 insurance companies writing workers' compensation policies in the state of Illinois, and that's the #1 figure in the United States. The incidence of claims is decreasing since 2011. Workers' compensation claims in Illinois have dropped from approximately 60,000 a decade ago to just about 40,000 in the last few years, a large reduction in the number of cases that are being reported and filed. Another indication is a decreasing losses faced by insurance companies. So according to a report from an organization called the National Academy of Social Insurance, there's been a 12% decrease in incurred losses from 2006 through 2012, the last time I was able to find that statistic. There's a statistic or a data point called the loss ratio. And prior to the changes in 2011, the loss ratio for insurance companies was up above 100. It's now dropped to something like 92 or 93, which represents a 23% drop since the reductions were made in 2011. So there are a lot of indicators to show that the 2011 workers' compensation reductions have accomplished the result that they were intended to accomplish, which is to reduce workers' compensation costs for the employers of Illinois. So that's what we know for certain, and really there's no question about that, there's no doubt about that. Compensation to injured workers has gone down. Medical reimbursements to doctors and hospitals that treat injured workers have gone down. Workers' compensation costs to Illinois employers have gone down. Workers' compensation rates have gone down. Number of workers' compensation claims, gone down. Workers' compensation insurance loss ratios, gone down. That's what we know for sure. But here's what we don't know. We don't know whether those savings and those reductions have actually translated into reduced premiums for Illinois employers, insurance premiums. Why are premiums so important? Premiums are so important because 99% of the Illinois, 99% of the employers in Illinois provide workers' compensation coverage through insurance, through an insurance policy. And so that employer has only one workers' compensation cost, the cost of paying for that policy, right? It's like when you buy your automobile insurance. That's your cost for maintaining your insurance for that year. So the question for those 99% of Illinois employers is, have their premiums gone down as a result of all these documented reductions and documented savings that we've already talked about? And certainly, the anecdotal evidence seems to be that workers' compensation premiums for insured Illinois employers have not, in fact, gone down. In fact, we hear reports, some as recently as last week by some minority-owned businesses, that workers' compensation premiums for those employers have actually gone up, despite the 20% reduction recommended by the rate-making organization. So workers' compensation premiums are important for the vast majority of Illinois employers, and there's simply no evidence, and there seems actually to be evidence to the contrary, that premiums have gone down for insured employers. We know for a fact that total premium has gone up. So since these changes went into effect in 2011, we know that total premium in Illinois has increased from something like $2.4 billion a year to something like $2.7, $2.8 billion a year. So we know that total premiums have gone up, right, rather than going down anywhere near that 20% that rate reduction would have suggested. We tried to take a look at it in terms of premium per policy issued in Illinois, because what some people have said, well, of course, as employment goes up in Illinois, as payroll goes up, of course total premium is to go up. But even if you look at it in terms of premium per policy issued in Illinois, it seems that premium has actually gone up as opposed to being decreased or being decreased anything like 20%. We tried to take a look at it in terms of premium per worker, per covered worker in Illinois. And again, the numbers suggest that premiums have actually gone up instead of going down or going down anywhere near that 20%. As President Carrigan has already mentioned, what does it mean if the premium had gone down by that 20% recommendation that NCCI made? If you add it all up since 2011, it's well over $1.5 billion that should have been delivered back to the insured employers of the state of Illinois in terms of premium reductions. And that's 1.5 billion with a B, right? So the question is why, if it's in fact the case that premiums have not gone down, why is that the case? Well, one might suggest that it's because insurance companies in the state of Illinois are for-profit entities. So perhaps that is an explanation of where those savings in fact went. So that's a little bit about what the reductions were. That's a little bit about what the results of the reductions were, and a little bit about what that had to do with premiums and rates. I just want to take one last second to mention a couple of bills that have already been passed. So back in last year around this time, the House passed a bill, House Bill 1287, which was sponsored by Speaker Madigan. And what's interesting to me about this bill is that it really focused on reducing premiums for Illinois employers. It had a provision in the bill that would have tightened the scrutiny that the Department of Insurance applies to insurance companies charging excessive premiums, as President Browder has already talked about. The other interesting thing that it did, and which is just not talked about enough, the nurses already talked about it a little bit, is that there was a focus on that bill on safety in the workplace, right? The surefire way to avoid a workers' compensation case and the costs that come along with it is to avoid an injury in the first place, right? House Bill 1287 established safety programs that employers could institute in their places of business that would then allow them to have some type of premium rebate or premium reduction, because the focus would have been on safety where it should be. The Senate also passed a bill back in 2015, Senate Bill 162, which also had some of these types of ideas in the bill regarding safety and insurance premiums. So, thanks for your attention.
And how do you spell Manchetti?
M as in Mary, E as in Echo, N as in Nancy, C-H-E, T as in Tom, T as in Tom, I, Manchetti.
We'll open it up for a few questions.
Yeah, let me, I'm not sure who that, who would want to say, obviously, the businesses are saying that the issue is causation, and to your point, the lawyer here just spoke, on 1287, you would say on-site safety, the sure way to avoid is to improve safety at the workplace. The employers would often argue, but with causation, their whole point is you could be injured off-site and then have a workers' comp. Should we change or take a, what's wrong with looking and tightening the controls on making sure that what we're paying for is an injury that was on the work site and not on the golf course or on a softball game on the weekend?
I'll begin, but then I'm going to hand it back over to David. First of all, the organizations that are up here today holding this press conference, you know, we're not about fraud, employee fraud, any kind of misrepresentation about how an injury occurred. But fraud is a two-edged sword. I've just talked to you a minute about employee fraud, but there's also employer fraud that gets into misclassification of workers and trying to take actual injuries and run them through the normal healthcare system. So, that's a debate that goes on, but I want to be clear, we're not here to protect employees that are engaging in fraud. Now, to causation, I'm going to turn this back over to David Manchetti, but anybody's got a few years on themselves, 40, 50 years, you've got injuries. Just the wear and tear of life, and you could have been hurt in the military, you could have been hurt in high school or college, but then, you're a fine employee, you're showing up to work, you're doing your job, you're the employee of the month, the employee of the year, but then suddenly you get injured, and then here comes the worker comp insurance company saying pre-existing condition. David, I'll let you take it from there.
So I just want to reiterate what President Carrigan said. In 2011, the fraud provisions that would be applicable to somebody who claims they got hurt on the job but really got hurt at home were enhanced, okay? It's a felony in the state of Illinois to claim to have been hurt at home, or to claim to have been hurt at work and to have been hurt at home. So there are very, very few fraudulent claims. In fact, you can look at the Department of Insurance report in this regard. They've been running this fraud unit for many years now, and there are very few reported cases of out-and-out fraud. Regarding the issue of causation, it is at least misleading, if not absolutely inaccurate, to say that you don't have to prove that it happened at work, right? This law specifically says, explicitly says that you have to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that your accidental injuries arose out of and in the course of your employment, by a preponderance of the evidence. So it's absolutely incorrect to say that you don't have to show that it happened at work. That's a mischaracterization, if not somehow intentionally misleading. Number two, and this is you have to prove both of these things. You have to prove that by a preponderance of the evidence, again, a preponderance of the evidence standard, that the condition from which you're suffering is causally connected to those accidental injuries that you had to prove by a preponderance of the evidence happened at work, all right? So you've got two hurdles to meet as an injured worker. You've got to prove arising out of and in the course of employment by a preponderance of the evidence, and you've got to prove medical causation by a preponderance of the evidence. So these people who say it doesn't have to happen at work and you only have to prove 1% causation, that is a misstatement of the current law.
Somebody was talking about where Illinois sits percentage-wise and the cost has come down. I think what the governor talks about a lot is where Illinois sits versus other states. Do we know what number we are in range of benefits? I think we said we're like in the top, I don't know, 7 or something as far as cost. Do we know where we are versus other states?
Yeah. Would you like?
Go ahead.
Okay. So a number that has sometimes been cited is 7, right? And the question is, where does that number come from? Who did that study? So as opposed to being some type of impartial organization, that study is from the Oregon Department of Commerce, right? And you wouldn't be surprised to find out that in the Oregon Department of Commerce study, Oregon does pretty well, okay? But I don't even know, to tell you the truth. But the fact of the matter is that if you look at that study itself tells decision makers like legislators, do not use this study to compare state to state, because that study is not a study of comparable costs of the workers' compensation system. It's a manipulated number called the premium index. You figure what that exactly means. The report has 2 pages in it that tells decision makers like legislators, be careful how you use this number, because you're not necessarily comparing apples to apples or apples to oranges.
Do you know where Illinois sits on any realistic study?
Well, if you look at that median number that I talked about earlier, right, from 2011 until now, that was the biggest decrease in the country, the largest decrease in the country since 2011.
But then in raw numbers, where does that bring that down to?
Well, it's interesting when you talk about the raw numbers, right? Because the raw number of that Oregon Premium Index that we talked about is actually smaller today, the raw number, than it was in 2005, let's say, when Illinois was, say, 23rd as opposed to 7th. The raw number is actually smaller today. And what does that tell you? It tells you that other states have engaged in this race to the bottom, right? They've been slashing their workers' compensation systems to get to the bottom, to get to where they're paying 0 workers' compensation benefits. And of course, anything's going to be greater than 0, right? So whereas the raw number is smaller today than it was 10 years ago, Illinois' ranking is higher today than it was
Right, well,
10
that's
years
right.
ago.
I mean, but do you have any realistic view of, is Illinois in the middle of states or near the most expensive, but perhaps because we have higher paying jobs, or is it the lower rate because of all of this from 2011, or do you know where we sit between 1 and 50, or is there not a range?
Well, one thing, it's really hard to know where you're accurately sitting.
Could you go to the mic to respond?
One thing, it's hard to know where you're accurately sitting in trying to rank where we are when these cost savings haven't been passed on. So you've had the reforms, you had the reforms put in place, and after you've had the reforms put in place, you haven't had cost savings passed on. So where does it make a difference where we supposedly rank when you haven't looked at what the actual costs and what the premium should be and where we're at? So without insurance reform and doing some studies on where we're at, you can't use those rankings.
When I heard one of the business guys, I think it was Todd Meisch of the State Chamber yesterday, say, this is a stale argument that you're using about the insurance companies are claiming, so many companies self-insure, and I know you said it was 1%, I don't know. Somebody recently, I don't know if it was him, said, well, our factory could spend like 1/3 of what it spends on workers' comp if we were in Indiana. True, false, good, bad, why? So much.
Well, and if you find a state that is a race to the bottom, if you go to the next state where wages are lower, safety is lower, payments are lower, you could be in that situation. But we want to take care of the injured workers here. And the last thing we want is where we started, we want worker safety. We want to take care of injured workers that do get hurt on the job. That includes any of us. If we get hurt on the job, we want to make sure that we can get back to health and go to our job, or that if we can't, that we do get benefits. And that's what Illinois is doing well. We have made the changes, as Dave mentioned, to the system. Now we need to let it play out and come into place. But I do think, as part of this discussion, you do need to have insurance reform, that you look into it. And instead of trying to blame the injured and the people who have been killed on the job for the state's woes when it comes to the budget and the pensions, we need to get those things first. But as part of this discussion, we should look at insurance reform.
What can be done, including by you folks, to make Illinois a better place to do business? All I've heard for the last 2 years is Illinois sucks. I feel like leaving myself, it's so bad. What can be done to make it a more attractive place to come and stay and run a successful business?
When you say Illinois is doing so poorly, all you have to do is go through an airport in our neighboring states. You go through Indianapolis, Milwaukee, St. Louis, and what do you see? Closed gates, less air traffic. Illinois is doing great. We have a lot of business that is here. We have businesses coming to the state. We have more commerce going in and out of Chicago here than most airports in the country. And it is going to other areas. And sure, there's things that we could do to improve, but that's for the men and women upstairs to come up with a budget and solve these problems to be able to make things better for the citizens and the workers here.
Perry, or Mike, the thing is though, how do you explain the governor, who's not a dumb man, you might disagree with him, how do you explain that you have all the business groups collectively saying we need to reform workers' comp? I mean, do they not know their own businesses? It's almost as if you're saying they're just misunderstanding the reality that things are much better than they seem.
The purpose of this press conference today was to talk about, we're not interested in tying worker comp changes to the budget. The governor continues to talk about, in order to get a budget, it's got to be predicated on components of what he calls the turnaround agenda. We adamantly oppose, we do not think that's a way to conduct worker comp discussions. As David indicated, his firm has been with the Illinois AFL-CIO for decades. Agreed bill process has been used for worker comp for decades. It's been called by Republican governors, it's been called by Democratic governors, and back in 2011 it was called, and it worked. There was hard negotiations, difficult negotiations. Wasn't fun to be in that room, but it resulted in a significant reform to workers' comp. Now, we are invited to a legitimate worker comp meeting. We would start with just what's already been said. Safety, we would start with insurance reform, and then we've been talking about a state-funded comp system to ensure it's part of insurance regulation. Those are the kinds of things that need to be discussed, and that would help drive down costs and make Illinois a better place. But I, for one, as a lifelong citizen of Illinois, I'm tired of a governor and his administration just running down and always criticizing this state. It's not a poor state. This state is, Illinois. From the Illinois AFL-CIO, we're the third largest organization in the nation. Only New York and California are bigger in terms of density, population of the state feds.
Well, Mike,
This is a good state to do business in.
When we have the head of Caterpillar increasing factories in other states and saying they won't even consider building a new plant, if you guys are right, what are we to make of that? Does he not know his own business?
Well, all I can say is I think he's looking at a race to the bottom, which has already been pointed out. What are the lowest wages I can pay? What are the lowest benefits I can pay? What's going to get me out of legitimate worker comp cases? I'm not going to be part of that. That's not what I've taken an oath of office to protect. I'm here to protect the rights and benefits of workers. So let's take maybe one more question, and it's a busy day and a busy week, so we need to move on.
Mike, you're saying that this has been an agreed upon thing for years.
Decades.
Decades. The governor has said that a big part of the state's problem is It's just been quote over and over and over every year. When you're saying that sort of thing was been agreed upon and things haven't changed, I mean, aren't you just basically saying what he's saying and really not really helping your case, but helping his?
This press conference started, the governor took his oath of office 16-plus months ago. If worker comp was a real priority to him, and he knew the history of how worker comp is done, then I would have thought a year ago, 8 months ago, 6 months ago, there would have been meetings to focus on only worker comp through the agreed bill process. He hasn't done that. That's his mistake, not ours. So with that, we're going to bring this to an end, and thank you for coming today.
Thanks, Mark.